This is where the future begins. It's time to invest in our future. It's time to help our schools improve for the future. And it's time to give our educators what they need to innovate for the future. Because the future of Texas is in our public schools.
Educate Texas is an initiative of the Communities Foundation of Texas. We are dedicated to working side by side with our partners to empower students to realize their dreams and fuel a thriving Texas. Visit edtex.org to learn more about our work.
All across Texas, there are people and organizations who want to invest in a brighter future for all Texans. We bring philanthropists together to support public education, from the schoolhouse to the State House. We are the Texas Education Grantmakers Advocacy Consortium. Learn more at tgac.org.
Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Texas believes in honest conversations like the one you're about to see. For thoughtful insights related to healthcare policy, check out our Blue Promise podcast and videos. Learn more at standingwithtexas.com.
Hello, folks. Good morning. Welcome to Coronavirus in Texas, a virtual event series from the Texas Tribune. As with most of the state, the Tribune has temporarily paused our in-person live events, but we're moving the conversation online with this series of virtual interviews. I'm here today with John Sharp, Chancellor of the Texas A&M University System, and we'll be discussing the effects that the current outbreak is having on higher education until about 8:45 this morning. Chancellor Sharp and I are also going to be going over questions that have been submitted by our readers throughout the conversation. A couple of quick housekeeping things before we get started. First, we want to thank our sponsors for supporting today's conversation. We have Pearson, Educate Texas, Texas Education Grantmakers Advocacy Coalition, Blue Cross and Blue Shield, the Trello Foundation, Raise Your Hand Texas, and the Texas A&M Foundation. We also want to thank KXAN, KPRC2, Univision 62, Community Impact, and the Eagle for their media support. Though donors and corporate sponsors underwrite our events, they play no role in determining the content, panelists, or line of questioning. Finally, if you want to keep tabs on the latest coronavirus news in Texas, subscribe to our evening newsletter for updates at trib.it/coronavirus. And with that, please join me virtually in welcoming Chancellor John Sharp. He led the Texas A&M University System since 2011. Previously, he served in the Texas House and Senate, was State Comptroller, and was on the Texas Railroad Commission. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us this morning, Chancellor.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you, too. So to start, I just want to ask kind of a basic question. Due to this pandemic, classes are being taught remotely. Most students are now home. For those of us who aren't there, can you just tell us who is still on campus and what do these online classes look like, particularly hands-on courses like chemistry labs?
Okay. Well, there's still about, system-wide in all 11 schools, there's about 5,400 students left on campus. And that's generally students that where this is home. They don't have another place to go. They can't get to another state. They can't get to another country. The foster students, kids that this is the place that they have to go. Also, there are a number of kids from small rural places where online education is difficult because of the internet connections, and so some of them have chosen to stay in the school. So at A&M, for instance, is about 2,000 on the main campus. There's about 5,470, I think, as of yesterday, system-wide in the deal, which is about 20%, lower than 20% of what the norm for those kids are.
You mentioned this, and I just want to ask, with the move to online classes, like you just said, you have students moving out of dorms. You also have some moving out of off-campus apartments where they signed a year-long lease. You have international students, as you alluded to, those without a stable home, those maybe without good Wi-Fi. So do you mind just going a little bit into more detail about what happened to those different groups of students at A&M campuses?
Yeah, let me give you an example of what, and this is one of the, if there can be a bright spot found in this coronavirus deal. When I first got here, there was a real reluctance, I think, among all flagships in particular, to do online education because they thought that, maybe it wouldn't be the total experience, and for whatever reason, there was a lot of reluctance to do it. Except in the regionals, you had places like West Texas A&M, Texas A&M Commerce, and others that do lots of online and have for some particular time. Then all of a sudden, this comes around. In 8 days, Texas A&M, for instance, put 58,000 students online, and almost flawlessly. I mean, it's absolutely amazing what has happened here. And that's not going to go away after this coronavirus pandemic is ended. It's still going to be there for particularly places like large freshman classes that may have 300 kids in a class or something like that. I can make you the argument that it's more personal and more upfront and personal online than it is sitting in the back of a big classroom like that. It's going to be used for tutoring. It's going to be used for for finding someone that maybe is 15 hours short of graduation, but for whatever reason had to leave college. It's going to be used for those folks. And so what didn't happen over an 8 or 10 year period of time all of a sudden happened in 8 days. And it's absolutely amazing what these professors and what these administrators and folks in all the universities, and I'm sure it's the same thing at the University of Texas and University of Houston and other places, have put together that's going to really change, I think, for the better, a lot of the delivery of some of these courses.
Do you, in terms of what's going to remain after the online class period goes away, you see these online services as being a supplement to the in-person services and in-person large lectures, or replacing some of those?
Yeah, I think it'll be a supplement. I mean, I think it's going to be used for. I think it's going to be up to the professors. I mean, obviously you can't use it for laboratories, and you can't use it for almost any kind of lab, whether it's engineering or biology or whatever. But that infrastructure all of a sudden is there, and what's happened is all of a sudden the stigma that was attached to online. Oh, we're not going to do that. That's foreign to what our culture is. Oh, this actually works. This actually, we can get questions from our students. It's pretty darn personal. I would argue, as I have, more personal than 300 or 400 kids sitting in a classroom in a freshman course. And it's going to be, it will change how education is delivered for the better in many of the classrooms, and allow the universities to reach out further, especially to students that cannot come back for traditional education because they're working or because they're doing other things. But I'm really proud of what has happened, not only at Texas A&M, but in all of these regional campuses, in literally a period of 8 days, to put up 150,000 kids in online classes was really, I thought, pretty amazing.
How, you mentioned the hands-on labs and things like that. How are those being done at this point?
Well, the research in particular is still going on. If it is research that would have caused, like if you're experimenting with cell lines, and all of a sudden if you quit and walked away, all of a sudden years of research would be destroyed. Those still happen. Precautions are being taken. Social distancing is happening within those laboratories and things like that, within some engineering labs and things like that. One of the things that when you look at anticipating your next question, when you look at okay, what do you think enrollment is going to be, in the summer and the fall and stuff like that? Frankly, we're pretty optimistic. Certainly optimistic at Texas A&M. I was talking to Mike Young yesterday and looking at his figures about deposits and acceptances for summer school, right on track with where they were last year. Fall courses, right on track, a bit ahead of where they were last year. Where I think most schools are going to have in Texas are going to have could experience a shortfall is in master's programs that are heavy in out of international students, and we don't know what's going to happen with regard to that. But what's happening in a lot of that is it's really intensive work being done to try to convince kids from this state and this country to participate in those master's programs, which are important for a couple of reasons. One, the education value, but two, is those are the students that are used to do a lot of the research that happens within universities.
One last question about the chemistry classes, because I'm just having a little bit of trouble envisioning it. So are the engineering and science-based students there to go to in-person labs with precautions, or are they doing simulations online for this semester?
Yeah, there are some labs that are open and some that are not. But when a lab is open, it follows all of the social distancing things, including in the dormitories and including wherever students are. Anytime they're on this campus, they have to follow certain protocols with regard to social distancing and all of the things that the health professionals have told them to follow.
You mentioned that some students who still are on campus are there because they live out in the rural areas where they don't have online access or the ability to get online. For students who did not choose to stay on A&M campuses but do have trouble getting online, lack stable Wi-Fi, maybe don't have a computer at home, what does A&M do to identify and then support those students take advantage of these remote classes?
One of the things that we do is in a lot of the campuses is we'll take a parking lot, for instance, and we'll completely Wi-Fi that parking lot. So where all you have to do is just drive into the parking lot and on campus and with your laptop and access it. We obviously don't go back into your hometown of Timbuktu, Texas, and install Wi-Fi, but we try to make it as accessible as possible to anybody. For instance, if you're still here in College Station and you're in an apartment and you want to be on campus or access the internet directly here, you can go to those kinds of hotspots that have been put in on various campuses, including this one, to access that.
I'm going to turn to a couple audience questions because they're relevant to the online learning question. One reader wrote in and asked, quote, how will the lessons you and the Texas A&M University staff have learned during this event evolve instructional models over the long term for our school and our students?
Well, I think one of the things that we just mentioned is that online education isn't the booger bear that a lot of faculty and a lot of administrators thought it was. That it can be a big asset to what college education is all about. The second thing that I'd like to point out too is that you hear talking heads every now and then say, "Oh, you don't need a college degree anymore." That's not it. Well, if you look at the jobs that were created since the financial downturn and Great Recession began in 2008, there was about 11.5 million new jobs created since that particular time. 11.3 million of those required or had some college education in it. And so, in any metric that you look at, you earn about 78% more with a college degree than you do with a high school degree. And that's only going to get worse. I mean, I would say worse. It's only going to become more emphasized because of the kind of things that are happening. And if you go 10 or 15 years out into the future, and you look what driverless cars, driverless trucks. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of people in the United States that drive trucks and make good salaries. That may not exist 10 years from now because right here on the A&M campus, we have platooning 18-wheelers that have nobody in it that are driving around, and that's going to become mainstream for better or for worse sometime in the future. And so it is really, college education is becoming really more and more important in the future. And I think that is one of the reasons that we're growing so fast. One of the things that we have to do now, though, when Hurricane Harvey hit, we put in a provision called Regents Grants, because there were a lot of students that lost their cars, lost their clothes, and a whole bunch of things like that. And we're drawing on that $10 million that we put into that fund for students all over the system as well, to make sure that if their parents lost a job working in a restaurant, something like that, or wherever, they have the ability to meet basic needs in order to continue their education and things like that. And so there's lots of stuff like that all universities are doing, I'm sure, to make sure that their students are back again in the fall and complete their education.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a little bit more about the financial impact, but before we move on, we've been talking about students. This is another question from the audience. How do you ensure A&M System staff and faculty are supported during this time too?
Well, we make sure, first of all, that A&M faculty and staff follow the same protocols as everyone else does. We make sure that they're protected by making sure that the students we practice social distancing. One of the things that we did here in Brazos County is our Texas Veterinary Medical Diagnostic Lab, which is a state agency that's within the A&M system, has learned that the tests that they give to horses, for instance, work just very well in detecting COVID-19 in humans. And so they made available to all of our universities about 2,000 of those tests in the communities that they live in, to make sure that the faculty, the students, and the staff and the folks are able to have more than normal testing for COVID-19 and things like that. So we're doing everything we can to make sure that everyone that participates in this feels comfortable in the surroundings, and that we follow the social distancing and protocols and make sure that they don't try not to contract it.
What staff are still working at this point on campus? Which staff are still working on campus?
The staff that has to do with transportation to move folks around, the staff that has to do with dining. We still have grab and go food for the students that are here. So the transportation, those that are involved in housing, we have people that move through all of the dormitories with disinfectants and things on a regular basis, and from everything from doorknobs to door plates and everything else. And so those folks that are basically here that still serve the students that have to that are located here within Bryan College Station, the housing, the dining, and things like that. You mentioned something about what's the financial impact of this. The financial impact it goes pretty much like this in the system wide. So we've refunded dining and refunded housing costs to students that have asked for that refund. We've given them a choice. They can either get a cash refund or they can apply it to next year. And we've done refunds of about system-wide about $48 million. It has cost just under $10 million to set up the online classes and all of those connections and stuff like that. And lost revenue from stuff like athletics, parking, transportation services, and fees like that have been about $33 million. The state of Texas, in the CARE Act that was passed by Congress, got about $1 billion for the state of Texas, plus about $300 million for the governor's fund. Of that $100 million, of that $1 billion for higher education, the Texas A&M System, we anticipate we'll get about $110 million. About half of that will go directly to the students, particularly it was weighted toward campuses with high Pell Grant students. And the other half will go into the universities themselves.
So you said $48 million for refunds, and then half of $100 million goes to the system. So you still have costs that aren't covered.
Right. That's right. But that's why we always encourage our universities to have 3 months reserves, and that's what we're having to draw on in order to keep the ship going.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned $10 million to go online. I saw that the American Council on Education had asked for $7.8 billion to support the transition to remote learning nationally. What is involved in taking the university experience and putting it online in 8 days, like you said, in terms of the technology and the faculty training and the cost?
Well, it was amazing how quickly the faculty did this. I mean, try to imagine. I mean, this is something that we've been talking about. Most universities have been talking about for 10 years or better, and mostly a lot of reluctance from particularly big flagship universities and research universities. And all of a sudden, in an 8-day period of time, they had it up and running, absolutely no hitches whatsoever. We couldn't find any hitch anywhere in the system. It worked so well. And that was because of the faculty and because of the administrative staff that put all these things together. So obviously, you have to have, equipment, you have to have software, you have to have, cleaning supplies for all of that stuff and everything at the same time. And so the $9.7 million that we think was invested mostly had to do with equipment, and had to do some with outside training that we contracted to come in and instruct everyone on how to do it. But it was amazing to me to watch how quickly that came up and how flawlessly it worked in the first place. And it's going to be nothing but better in the future as people get used to it. But it's going to be a tool. Another thing, Shannon, if you want to look for bright spots in this, and this is a bright spot for some, but not for others. But we have large construction projects that have not yet started in Houston, with our Innovation Plaza there and TMC 3 construction and stuff like that. Interest rates are likely to keep falling. If they do, that's going to make that a heck of a lot cheaper. And construction costs, quite frankly, will wind up probably falling as a result of this too. And so, as tragic as it is, there are at least some things that are going to wind up operating easier and cheaper than we anticipated anyway.
I mentioned this memo from the American Council on Education asking for money from Congress. They cited expenses, nationally, universities facing expenses like deep cleaning, canceling for uninsured events. You also have universities like UTSA and A&M offering partial refunds for housing while also keeping auxiliary services open for students who have nowhere else to go. So, can you just talk us through the impact that the responding to the virus has on A&M System's budget and how you think that will play out in the coming months or years?
Well, the $33 million that we're going to lose because of athletic programs and because of events and transportation and things like that, we don't know how that's going to play out. And the reason we don't know is we don't know how long this shutdown is going to continue. We get questions a lot about football. Okay, basketball is gone, baseball is gone, stuff like that. Those are obviously whether you like them or not, big revenue producers, but nothing like the revenue producer of football. But in some conversations with SEC officials and NCAA, I think they've come to the conclusion that you can probably start football as late as October and still have a 13-day game schedule. And so we don't know when this thing is going to end. We don't know when this is going to happen. You know, for all we know, we may have football where we have coaches and players and referees on a field with the TV camera and nobody in the stadium. We don't know, but we're trying to figure all of that out. But none of it can be even discussed until we know when the world goes back to work, and we'll hopefully find that out in a few weeks.
So at this point, are you planning for in-person classes to resume in the fall, or are you planning for them to stay online?
We're planning for both. We're hoping that in-person classes will resume in the fall, but if not, we are ready to do online education until we can get kids back in the classroom.
You mentioned that the universities you encourage your campuses to have reserves, cash reserves they can draw on. In terms of the budget, are you considering other options, you know, laying off staff, tuition increases? How do you see the finances working out?
Well, whenever the legislature, in the budget documents that the legislature sends all universities and all state agencies, one of the things they ask you for every legislative session, regardless of whether there's a coronavirus or not, is what if you had to cut 10%? And the instructions that we've given our folks when they submit those documents is, do not give me 10% across the board. That's the easy thing to do. Give me the specific things that you believe are your very lowest priority that ought not be there. One of the interesting things in business and in all government agencies is there's generally things that the head of the agency or the head of the business knows good and well is not a priority for that particular agency and should have been done away with a long time ago. But because there are 10 students and 4 alumni that raise Cain if you touch it, it's just too much trouble to mess with. And so something like this, although tragic, gives you the opportunity to look at those kinds of things and reprioritize yourself. And that's one of the things that will happen when we submit budget documents and when everybody else submits their budget documents. But my instructions to all of the universities and to all of the agencies is, don't give me a 10%, across the board cut. That's way too easy. I want you to give me the specific things that you would change that would produce that. But we have, one of the things, higher education historically always suffers a much higher percentage cut than the rest of government. I mean, if you look at the last sessions where you had difficult times, you had Article 2 was exempt, the healthcare agencies, and public education was exempt. Well, when you take those two out, there's not much left. And so when the last time this happened, higher education absorbed 40% of the cuts, and we're only 15% of the budget. And so we're hoping, everyone talked about this next session was going to be the session of higher education. We're hoping that we can put that into practice. And for our part, we're going to do the things that are necessary in order to streamline ourselves. We have opportunity to do that. I think we will. But fortunately, I think most universities have 2 to 3 months reserves. And so assuming this thing doesn't drag on for a very, very long time, I think we'll be able to struggle into the next session of the legislature without harming our students.
Just to be clear, have you laid off staff? Are you considering that?
No, we haven't. We have what we have done is I have told all 7 of our agencies in the system and all 11 of our universities in the system that we have a partial hiring freeze. In other words, no one within an agency can be hired. No one within a university can be hired without the specific permission of the president of the university or specific permission of the CEO of the agency. It takes a while sometimes to hire faculty, and so there were faculty that were approved and contracted and ready to go long before this, and those will be followed through. But what we want is we don't want someone that's head of a division within an agency to be able to make those decisions at this particular time. That decision is going to be the responsibility and of the CEO, and that CEO will be held accountable for that until we figure out exactly what's going to happen. We have to be very judicious in doing that, and we've had that in effect for several weeks now.
And tuition increase, do you see this playing a role in that?
This is not a time for tuition increases, so we likely that's not going to happen. If in inflation at best. I'll tell you one thing we worry about though is inflation, and what's going to happen at the end of this. Anytime you have government puts this much money, trillions of dollars into the world economy, chasing a smaller amount of goods. I'm not sure, but it sure looks like that's a recipe for inflation sometime in the future. And so our economists and people that are modeling this are really starting to worry about what inflation is about. Obviously, we're all concerned about what's happening in oil in particular, and in the oil patch, and when Saudi Arabia and Russia are going to quit feuding. But that's the least of our problems. And I mean, demand for oil because of all of this has really been given a shock. And so there's never been an instance that I've seen where you have Saudi Arabia and OPEC producing a glut at the same time that demand has almost completely collapsed throughout the world. And so we're hoping for a V-shaped recovery, but some of our economists are not convinced that it might be a W-shaped recovery before it's over with. But we'll see that after it's over with.
So, as Chancellor, you oversee a range of institutions. Has the impact on, the A&M flagship versus Prairie View A&M, what has been the differences in how each campus is affected?
Well, I think that all of them have the regionals actually lead in some areas like online education and others, but all of them have something to contribute to the COVID-19 response, for instance. For instance, in little Texas A&M Texarkana, they have probably one of the most knowledgeable people with regard to SARS and coronaviruses that exist anywhere in the world. As a matter of fact, that professor, Dr. Ben Newman, was on the team that named COVID-19 and named the coronavirus. And so he is obviously involved with a lot of federal officials and other folks. We have people who are working in their labs on specific treatments for coronavirus, hoping to go into clinical trials. We have vaccines that we partnered with a group called iBio, which has a request into the federal agency BARDA, and has had for the better part of a month waiting for permission to begin clinical trials with regard to that vaccine. We have on the A&M campus a complete manufacturing facility. Whenever the federal government or anybody else comes up with a vaccine, that's one of the 3 places in the country that are public that can be used for manufacturing that vaccine. So they're ready to do it. We have folks that are in medical school in Houston that are 3D printing diffusers for the ventilators at Methodist Hospital. We have folks that are involved in a myriad of different ways. One of the other things too is the person that's in charge of all disasters is Nim Kidd, who is now a vice chancellor at the A&M System. If you recall, after Hurricane Harvey, when Governor Abbott asked the A&M System to run that Rebuild Texas program, at the end of that, the legislature removed that program from the Department of Public Safety and put it in the A&M System. And so all of our folks are deeply involved with Nim Kidd in the decisions that the governor has to make and implement with regard to that. And one of the things that we're starting to become involved in is the CARE Act money comes down. You've got you don't worry about Houston figuring it out. You don't worry about Dallas figuring it out or Austin or San Antonio, but smaller counties may not have the expertise to know exactly how to access that money. And so one of the things that we're doing is we're setting up a war room, if you will, and using our extension agents, just like we did in Hurricane Harvey, to take that information to the hospital in Victoria or Inferior or small places and show the local officials, help them access the CARE Act to make sure that their counties get what their counties, cities, hospitals get what they're supposed to get.
It looks like a little bit under 10 minutes left, so I want to turn to some audience questions. From Kelly H., who apparently graduated from A&M in the class of 1996. Will there be any change to the ACT, SAT, or other prerequisite requirements for admission to A&M System?
No, the only change may be with regard to graduate students. I mean, if we see a real serious downtick in graduate students, I think you'll see, and you already are seeing in engineering graduate students, that I think their criteria is if you have a 3.0 or better, you can get in graduate school, because they're anticipating that a lot of international students won't return. So it will be a great opportunity for American and Texas students to get into some graduate schools that were perhaps the standards were a little higher, in the past, and that's where the opportunity is going to be. I think with regard to the rest of the school, you're not going to see standards drop at all. As a matter of fact, A&M, as I said, is on track to admit, both in summer school and in the fall, even a higher number and a higher demand than they had the last year, and we're seeing that in a lot of our universities. We're not seeing much change in that demand.
From Emily Pete, how has COVID-19 affected your animal hospitals and research done on campus?
Yeah, well, if research is essential research, and it is research that if you stopped it, it would completely kill years of work that you've done before, that will continue. And so most of the research is being continued and following social distancing guidelines that the federal government and the states put out.
What do you think commencement ceremonies will look like this year?
What do I think that what will look like?
Commencement ceremonies?
Won't be commencement ceremonies. I mean, they've been delayed, but we won't have, we're not going to have 10,000 people in a Reed Arena and things like that. Perhaps Perhaps they can be delayed into the summer. We just don't know when this is going to happen. But as long as this social distancing stuff that the federal government is requiring us is put into place, it's still going to be the same. And we still, amazingly enough, I still get calls from folks, some of my classmates and others saying, "Hey, is this really a big deal? Why is everybody saying it's a big deal? I live over in Timbuktu County, and there's only 2 people that have it." And so it's amazing that you have a bit of a divide. You don't hear that in Dallas. You obviously don't hear it in Houston and Austin and big cities, but you do hear that quite a bit out in the hinterlands. People asking me about that.
What do you tell them?
Well, I tell them that the Vatican is closed down. The casinos are closed down. I've been told the houses of prostitution are closed down. And I say anytime heaven and hell agree on something, it's probably pretty serious, and you ought to close it down.
So one of our readers had written in to ask how you're supporting students. And I just want to tailor the question a little bit because I saw that one of the classroom Zoom sessions at Prairie View A&M was hacked by someone who used racial slurs, according to a memo from Ruth Simmons, the president there. So, how does A&M respond to that? And to the reader's question, how do you support students dealing with online education and an incident like this?
What that was Zoom, and you may know that the FBI put out a warning this morning about using Zoom, and I suspect the good folks at Zoom better figure out how to make their system secure. They're not going to have a business anymore. But that is happening in lots of different places, and every single time that we have seen it, it has been in the use of Zoom. Someone has hacked in and done stupid things and stuff like that. And so we tend to use alternatives to Zoom right now until they figure out how to get their act together.
And then how do you support, students during this transition?
Well, we have a whole bunch of different ways we support them with, if they're on campus. And if they're on campus, we make sure that they are fed, that we make sure that they have meals, we make sure that they have transportation, even though it's operating at a loss, and we make sure that they have, everything that they need in order to continue their education if they decide to stay on campus. Those that are back home, obviously we support them through the distance education and the online education that we're using. But we also have, as I mentioned before, we also use our Regents Scholarships. In other words, if someone has had an economic catastrophe in their family, we, along with the A&M Foundation, the Former Students Association, and others, provide resources to them through Regents Grants and things like that in order to get them through that particular, help them get through that particular crisis. We have peer-to-peer mentors. We have upperclassmen that will call freshmen, for instance, once a week, check on them, see how they're doing, and we match those folks up in a lot of our campuses. And there's literally a whole myriad of telehealth, for instance. If they need to access that, we have that as well, and almost anything that you can think of that we can provide them, we try to make sure that they do. If you're on campus, there is someone behind you almost every hour of the day that is cleaning, whether it's laptops, whether it's doorknobs, whether it's anything else, to try to make sure that we don't have spread here. And knock on wood, it's not, student spread here on campus or within the community is not out of the norm at all.
We just have 2 minutes left, so let me ask one last question. We've seen some universities like Rice open their residence halls to healthcare workers. I think that A&M is fast tracking its students in its nursing schools graduation so they can enter the workforce more quickly. Is A&M thinking of opening its residence halls to healthcare workers, and what can higher education institutions do to help combat the virus broadly?
Well, one of the things that we're doing is we're going to graduate some of our nursing students early because there's such a demand for them and to get them into the workplace. I haven't heard about opening residence halls. I mean, probably a big difference in doing if we were in Houston in a major metropolitan area as opposed to College Station, but I haven't heard of opening our residence halls to folks other than students here, and I don't think that's going to happen here. But there's almost anything you can think of that our students require. There's somebody that meets that demand, whether it has to do with, all of the healthcare facilities. Even if you have only 10% of your students left, all of the healthcare facilities on every campus is still staffed for them as well. We share the extra tests, the extra 2,000 tests that we got. We share those with the community at large. For instance, when we send those to Texas A&M Commerce, it's not just for commerce students. It's available to the local hospital there. It's available to folks in Amarillo and in different places where we have our campuses open.
Well, it seems like we're out of time. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you, Chancellor Sharp, for joining us. And if you want to keep tabs on the latest coronavirus news in Texas, subscribe to our evening newsletter at trib.it/coronavirus. Thank you all again.
Thank you.